May I ask you, since you brought up the First World War and we're on the cusp of a war right now, potentially a global war, what is the view of war by the banks? Like, what do the banks think of it? You've described the banks as the single greatest control mechanism of human behavior in a society, I think.
Particularly the central banks, because they have the
bigger the bank, the more the power, but their power extends beyond just like their relationships with other banks. Their power like determines a lot of what happens in your country. Yeah. And they're not under the control of voters, right? So it's an extra democratic institution, which happens to be the most powerful, which is like crazy. I'd love to know how that happened, but how do they feel about war?
Well, central banking and warfare are very closely linked. As I said, I mean, the modern major bank, the first modern major bank and central bank was the Bank of England, of course. And in the very act of parliament, the law founding it, it says this institution and mechanism, because they didn't want resistance. They don't mention Bank of England. What we're doing here is establishing the Bank of England. They kept that secret. We're doing a new mechanism by these investors to raise and lend a lot of money to the government, namely by establishing a company. Will be allowed to establish a company, that's the Bank of England, in order for what? In order to wage war. It was in order to make war. So they're closely linked. And of course, if you look at
its founding document, it says that.
In exactly the Act of Parliament establishing the Bank of England, it said the purpose is to make war. Do you know why the Federal Reserve was established? And there was a rush to establish it for 1914.
The year the First World War started.
Exactly.
Destroyed Europe. Yeah.
And again, it was done with subterfuge. I mean, they're gathering everyone.
Yes.
On the 23rd of December, 1913, when nobody was there. And then also introducing income tax. That's also the Bank of England. It was established together in the same act, calling for establishing new taxes. Why? Because when you have these central banks, privately owned central banks established, it's basically this trick where these entrepreneurs persuade the government, you don't want to issue money. Issuing money, we'll issue money for you. What? That's what they're essentially saying without being so direct about it. But that's what they want to persuade governments to give up the power to create money themselves. We'll do it for you. And we'll lend you the money. And henceforth, well, how do we get our money back? Well, we love to lend to the government because you can raise taxes. And that's why taxes were introduced. The federal income tax didn't exist before the creation of the Fed. It was also created in 1914.
So you couldn't have one without the other?
Well, whenever a central bank is created, they introduce new taxes. One way or another, yes.
The central bank of the United States, the Fed, was created right before the war. I mean,
yes,
right before the war,
exactly.
A few months before the war. What was the role of the central banks during that war? The most important war in the last 1,000 years.
Yeah, well, it was really at the pinnacle of the war economy. There's no doubt about that. It's very clear. And the same is true, of course, for the other side. And now from 1917, the US and Germany were at war, which is very sad. A lot of Americans are of German descent, and Germans didn't really want to be at war with Germany, but that's what happened. So we've got these two countries at war, sad, the soldiers dying in the trenches, and their economies organized as war economies. At the pinnacle of the war economies are the central banks. So who were the key players in the German central bank, the Reichsbank, which was 100% privately owned? Well, was somebody called Max Warburg, or Max Warburg, you might say in English. And who was at the pinnacle, in fact, was a founder of the Federal Reserve, and who was the key person there? It was somebody called Paul Warburg, his brother. But of course, the soldiers have to kill each other, and these two countries are at war.
Wait. The head of the German central bank and the head of the American central bank were run by brothers during a war between the U.S. and Germany?
Yes. Now, I have to qualify it. They weren't the formal governors, but they were the key people.
Did anyone notice this?
Well, some people did. I mean,
probably encouraged not to notice that.
With Paul Warburg, it was obvious because until 1911, he was a German citizen. He'd only just come over for that purpose to set up the Fed. And he was speaking, half German basically when he spoke English. So, it wasn't. I mean, if you were looking for some details, you'd quickly find this.
How did the brothers do during the war? Were they destroyed? Were their fortunes taken away?
Oh, no. Of course, Max Warburg stayed in power at the Reichsbank. He was the one who signed off on Hitler's proposed head of the central bank, even in the 1930s. It was also Max Warburg still.
They were those, I can't believe brothers were at.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Those banks.
Yes. And of course, I don't want to just, pinpoint the Warburg family, but, there's other families and there's many families. There's JP Morgan, and they're of various backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds and whatever. But the principle is we do have...
that it's an inside game.
Well, yeah, bankers, particularly those that are close to central banks and maybe are private owners of these central banks. And the Reichsbank was 100% privately owned. And, when I mentioned Keynes, when he became a director, he must have been an owner of this privately owned central bank because they have these rules. If you're a leading person, well, you must be a leading shareholder, That's how it works. So... Now, I just want to give you the other example of to prove this point that you don't need to have a crisis and a recession, even when the banks are bust. Because the second key example is 1945, Japan. Even Japan. So the Bank of Japan knew very well how to get out of these problems because in 1945 it was much worse. The banks were 100% bust. They were lending to the government, East Asian Greater Prosperity bonds, basically war bonds of a country just defeated. You could trade them in the flea market for almost nothing. And secondly, forced munition loans to, the military industry, most of which was also bankrupt or was not even in Japan any longer because the country of Japan shrank a lot, right, after 45. The whole of Manchuria, no longer under Japanese influence. Yes. Taiwan and Korea were intrinsic parts of Japan until 1945 for half a century.
Philippines, Vietnam.
Of course, these were added, during the Second World War. But, Korea and Taiwan were already for 50 years were part of Japan.
1905.
Exactly. So these banks were bust because all these loans had no value. It's like 100% non-performing loans. What do you do? Is 1945 a good moment to have a big banking crisis and long recession? No, because they had bigger problems. Most cities were devastated by these incendiary bombs and the carpet bombing of civilians, also like in Germany. So then you don't want a banking crisis and recession. What do? Well, you don't need to have one. The central bank buys the non-performing assets at face value and the problem is solved. And that's what they did. So you can't tell me the Bank of Japan didn't know what to do.